I mean, this is just the holy grail because most law firms, it's really hard to differentiate them from one to another. And so one of the last bastions of differentiation is the experience that the client has working with their lawyer.
You're listening to the Legal Mastermind Podcast with your hosts, Ryan Klein and Chase Williams, the go-to podcast for learning from the experts in the legal community about effective ways to grow and manage your law firm.
Welcome to another episode of the Lawyers Mastermind Podcast. This is Ryan Klein. As always, I have Chase Williams. What's going on, Chase?
Hey, Ryan. How are you?
Doing well. You know, it's almost the end of August. Football's right in the corner. So got to say I'm pretty excited about the weeks and months to come. Our guest today is David Freeman of the David Freeman Consulting Group. How's it going, David?
Doing well. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited to have you. David here. David is a two-time best-selling author. He was inducted into the National Law Journal Hall of Fame for being a top business development coach for 3 consecutive years. In addition to that, he's been doing his craft for about 25 years for over 200 law firms, and half of those were in the AmLaw 200. So let's get started today. The first question, of course, is I'd like to know what cross-selling is.
Cross-selling is an interesting beast. And, the big picture of it is that it's the opportunity that lawyers have within their firm to be able to get more services to come to other lawyers in the firm. And so that's the short form of it. There are a lot of challenges behind it. And so while it looks like a lot of low-hanging fruit that should be so simple to get, there are a lot of issues and obstacles to get in the way of it. And so one of the first things that I've done when I do this kind of work with firms, one of the most important things is in nomenclature, because not many lawyers want to be seen as salespeople to their clients, and very few clients want to be sold to. So right up front, when a leadership team says to their lawyers, we want you to cross-sell more, there's a little voice in the back of the head that says, I don't want to do this. And so to change the game, to reframe it, is often important. And so sometimes we look at it as cross-referring work, but actually my favorite term is cross-serving. Because if we are in service to the client, everybody's more likely to want to engage in those behaviors. At the end of the day, we're still going to get to the same place, which is offering more of our services to the client, but it's not through a selling lens, it's through a service lens. That in itself can really open up the door to get most lawyers more motivated to actually make this happen. And so I found that there are 3 major, what I call anchors to cross-serving or cross-selling. And I'm a big fan of measures. And of course, we know what the measures are at the end of the day, which is more revenue. But you've got to look at the progress measures, the thing that you can see, the milestones that get you there. So my first measure is how many times can we get our lawyers together internally to talk about cross-serving opportunities? That in itself can really trigger a lot of behaviors. A lot of times firms say, let's do it, but the lawyers are not getting together to really talk about it. That is step 1. Then, number 2, these lawyers then have to prepare for and go out and have meetings with the clients to talk about cross opportunities. I don't know many firms that measure that, but if you start measuring it, people will start doing it. And then the third thing is we wish that we'd get all the work we could from those meetings, but like any other sales situation, it could take 7 to 12 touches or whatever. So we have to have a measurement system in place on how can we keep the new lawyer coming in top of mind with that client. So that's sort of the big picture to all of this, to take a look at it through a different lens and to measure the right things that can activate the behaviors that we're looking for.
Can you give us a specific example of cross-selling?
Well, let's say that I am an employment lawyer in the firm. And Ryan, let's say that you're a corporate lawyer and the client has 1,000 employees and we're not doing any of their employment work. So I want to knock on your door and say, hey, Ryan, I would love to do some employment work for that client. Can we figure out a way to make that happen? Now, that sounds very easy. There's a lot of subtlety behind all that, like how do I approach you in a way that you don't think it's risky to the relationship? How do I make it easy for you to make the introduction to the client so it doesn't seem salesy? I mean, there's a lot that underpins this. And this was my most recent book on cross-selling. There are so many different elements. I came up with this process of what I call the 13 accelerators of cross-serving, because there are so many subtle pieces to this game that have to be in place. But to answer your question, that's a typical opportunity. You'll have firms that have estate planning lawyers. And so there are a lot of wealthy clients to a firm, but there's not a lot of cross introductions to the estate planning lawyers. And the estate planning lawyers are looking around saying, there's millions of dollars of work here if I was to finesse this properly and to be able to go after it. So those are some examples of where cross-selling nuggets are just a little bit under the surface that needs some mining to be able to go after them.
So it's kind of like, I don't particularly use this phrase a lot, but a little bit of money on the table.
Very much so.
I understood. Yeah, I appreciate you kind of going into detail about cross-selling, because for us, we know a little bit about upselling, but I can see how cross-selling is a little bit different, and especially on the legal industry. So talking a little bit more about cross-selling, and you pointed out a couple issues. What are some other issues that might inhibit someone from being able to participate in cross-selling?
You know, it was interesting. When I wrote the book, the beauty of writing a book is you become a real geek on something. And you start diving in on levels that one wouldn't normally see. And so I started to realize some of the things. There are things that are normal that we notice, like trust. That's probably one of the biggest issues. So back to the example before, if I knock on your door, Ryan, and say, hey, I want to meet your client, you might think that you don't know me. You don't know how well I'm going to provide service. I might screw something up, and that could risk the relationship. So unless you and I have a strong, trusting relationship, your knee-jerk reaction may not be open-armed, yes, sure, David, come on in and meet my client. So building good trust between the lawyers and the firm is a precondition to successful cross-serving or cross-selling. There are some issues with internal communication. In firms of decent size, it's rare that everybody knows what everybody else offers. So while I'm talking to my client, I'm learning about their business, I may not have questions in my head that are finding out opportunities for you. And so I don't know the range of services we have. Another thing, and going back to the subtlety of how this gets finessed, is if I'm coming to you, Ryan, I've got to do this in a way that's really going to serve your best interest. One of the conversations that normally don't happen would be something like, hey, Ryan, if this opportunity was to actually come together, talk to me about the level of service that you want from me. Tell me about the level of service that your client needs, because I recognize that every client is different. And I say this because I had a lawyer that I was coaching once, and we talked about cross-selling, and he stopped me right away. He said, let me tell you, I don't trust any of my partners. And when I kind of broke that down a little bit, it was that he had a bad experience. The lawyer did not give the level of service. And when we went deeper, he realized it was his fault because he never communicated his expectations. And so it's going to that level. There's another subtle piece here. I was just coaching somebody today, and we were talking about it. How do you split credit? And to have that conversation up front so there's no lingering crap that can show up later that somebody's uncomfortable because they just mismatched their expectations, that's an issue. From a firm level, often the compensation system is not aligned with making this happen. And there's two parts to this. One is the actual system doesn't motivate the desired behaviors, but another one is what I call compensation perception disorder. And what I mean by that is the comp system actually does reward it, but the lawyers don't know that. And so there's a leadership / communication effort that needs to go on to educate people about what the compensation system actually rewards. Another big part is that lawyers just don't know how to do it. This is selling with finesse, and it's a skill that they are not normally taught, and how to be able to do it well is something that training and other kinds of support can be helpful in. And then the big picture wrapping around this is usually some level of what I call the role of the watcher. Tracking, managing, measuring, keeping people accountable. You know, a lot of these things are flavor of the month. Managing partner comes, pounds on the table. We need to cross-sell this month. It happens a little bit, and then it's forgotten, and everybody goes back to their old pattern of behavior. And so this is going into a bigger question around culture, is how you create a culture of change, a culture of business development, and leaders are, the critical backstops to all of this.
So really, how do you get a lawyer into that mindset? I know a lot of lawyers don't want to do the selling, don't want to do the business development.
Yeah, it's an interesting game to play. And, the challenge that we often have is that for the most part, especially if you're in firms of medium and large size, these are very well compensated human beings. And so playing the money card isn't the one that necessarily will fire them up and get the behaviors you're looking for. And, we're looking to increase engagement. And when you look at studies like Gallup studies, they talk about how only 32% of workers are fully engaged in their job. 51% are not that engaged, and you got like 17% that want to get in the way of everything. So forgetting about the 17%, that's a hard group to change. We really want to work with the middle of the bell curve and how we get these people to get more engaged. And so there are techniques. Number one is communication, really letting people understand the why of doing things. And one of the things about cross-selling or cross-serving, it's an interesting statistic. Often when a law firm delivers more than, say, 3 or more services to a client, 3 or more practices to a client, the client is much more loyal over the long term. It's harder to woo them away because the client will see them as their law firm versus, I just used them for one practice. So there's a communication piece that says, hey, if you want to protect your client from poaching, bring in other lawyers from the firm. It'll wrap a loyalty cloak around your client. You also want to find the people who are the coalition of the willing people. Find the front end of the bell curve people, and then communicate the heck out of their successes. Recognition is huge in our profession. We like to look good to each other. And then when people in the firm start to see how much the pats on the back are happening for different lawyers based on business development behaviors, that creates a bit of a pull. And then another part of the bell curve wants to come in. This is, if you've heard the book Crossing the Chasm, they talk about how to get, attract the early innovators and so on, but you really want to start attracting the early majority, which is about a third of the population. And you do that by showing the successes of other people that are out there. So these are some of the things. The other thing is really tapping into the human part of the lawyer. We have some highly motivated people here. If we can really align business development with their personal goals, now you're going to get them fired up. I remember being at a retreat once or talking to lawyers that had this retreat. And at the retreat, they did a program where they asked them to anticipate what the next 5 years of new legal services or growing legal services would be. They came up with a brainstormed list of about 40. They then broke it down to the top, I think it was 7 to 10. And what was so interesting is that generally it was senior associates who raised their hand who said, I want to lead this effort, because they were excited about the law around autonomous vehicles, the law around drones, the law around law enforcement and body cameras, interesting stuff that tapped into their passion. When you tap into passion, people are going to give you their time. And so if we can make it their idea and access their inner entrepreneur, this is, again, going back to the culture piece, is we want a culture of people who are fired up. Forcing people to do it, I mean, that doesn't happen in most organizations. It's really hard to make happen inside of a law firm.
These are all very interesting points about how, culture and passion can align with some of the goals for business development and how that can go from a cultural aspect, in a positive way. Yes. I know from reading your website and some of your articles, on the flip side, there's also a culture of killers. And that's an interesting point I'd like to go over for a little while. Would you mind sharing with our audience what are some of the biggest culture killers nowadays?
Yeah, it's funny. I have a program that I'm doing called The Vampires of Business Development. And it's these soul-sucking, revenue-sucking, energy-sucking factors that get in the way of business development. And, my premise to my coaching, my life, I was a semi-pro athlete, and, I think so much of it is we all have really great potential, but there are obstacles that get in the way. And so the job of an individual, the job of a consultant, the job of a leader is to identify and try to obliterate those obstacles. And so some of those obstacles are, something like the silo mentality that exists inside firms, that there's a practice group mindset and we are focused on our practice group and we're not really thinking cross enterprise, which is why a lot of firms are moving more toward an industry group model, because that's a very collaborative, multifaceted group of people that come together. There's also inertia and bad habits and bad time management. Lawyers are coming in and they're basically getting measured on kind of one thing, which is billing those hours, generating that revenue. That's the straight up number. And to know that you've got to do other things to get you there is something that firms can do a better job of communicating. And so back to my 3 elements of cross-selling or cross-serving, let's measure the number of times that our lawyers get together to talk about cross-serving opportunities. Let's measure the times that they meet with clients, things of that nature. But we're not measuring the right things, so people are not managing their time the right way. And so many people say, I'm so busy. But there's usually a way to find time to do things. Whenever there's an emergency, if a new client comes in and they have to get something done, lawyers find the time to do it. So we've got to raise that level up of this is important enough to get it out there. There's also a fear of failure. That's a big one that most people have, but lawyers, I seem to see that they have it even more strongly. And so, they don't want to go out there and do something and look bad to the client, which is why I try to kill the phrase selling. And it's really about serving or relationship building. And you can work your way step by step to get to where you want to go. Another one that I think is just huge, and we talked about this as leadership is the backstop. When I talked also about the 13 accelerators of cross-serving, the mega accelerator is leadership, because they've got to be the ones to continue to drive this. And very few leaders that I've seen are trained in the art of being managers of this behavior, driving the lawyers to do the marketing, the selling, and the service. And so if they start doing it, and if they do it consistently, and it's not just, again, the flavor of the month, that's some of the things that can really overcome the obstacles that are out there.
So you mentioned some of these key accelerators, and that you mentioned a large one earlier. What are some other key accelerators that will help out lawyers?
Yeah, I think we'll talk about a few of them. I mentioned there are 13 that I've identified. One of them that is sort of the first domino that you can knock over, and it makes a lot of other things happen, is the client feedback accelerator. And firms are across the board on this. Some of them have some pretty good client feedback programs. Some are fair to middling. Some don't have much at all. But let's even talk about the firms that have good client feedback programs. I see this occurring at 3 levels. And most firms, I see it happening at maybe 1 level. The 1 level that I see it at is firm level client feedback, meaning, okay, this year, let's go identify, our top 5, 10, 15, or 20 clients that are really important to us. And let's go trot out the managing partner and maybe the CMO, and we will go ask them a bunch of questions. So it's a great process. You learn so much. And I've heard so many times lawyers who come back and say, it's almost like Christmas every time we do this. We come home with presents. There's new work there all the time. But that's, to me, level 1. Now let's go to level 2. Let's take it from a practice group or a department level. There may be a list of 5 or 10 really important clients to them that didn't make the firm's A+ list, but still, they should ask for feedback. They should use the same process, trot out the department head or somebody else, and ask for feedback from those clients. And then the 3rd level is, especially the partners, each partner has, I would say, let's just say 1 to 3 really important clients. Do the same thing. Have them go out, arm them with the same process and the same questions. It is an amazing tool to uncover new opportunities. So it's really two questions, two categories. One, it's asking for feedback. How did I do? Or how did we and the team do? Is there anything you'd like us to do differently? Like to talk to you about service, this, that, and the other. But then there's a proactive question. And this is where the money is, which is, this has been great. Thank you for the feedback. We really love working with you. Do you have anything else coming up that you're planning in fourth quarter, 2020 or whatever, where we could help you? Now, if the lawyers did a little homework and they saw that this client is planning to break ground on a new plant, if they bring that up, hey, I noticed that you're going to be opening up a new manufacturing facility. What are you doing about permitting? Do you need any help with financing, X, Y, and Z? Now you're asking cross-serving questions. And that just creates so much information, and now you are in service to them. The client feedback accelerator is huge. We talked about industry teams and client teams. Client teams, it's just tremendous opportunities to put the right people together in the room inside the firm, to learn about the possible needs for the client, to learn the probing questions that could be asked, so that the relationship lawyer can go in and say, hey there, client, by the way, one of our lawyers was talking about the new regulations for OSHA, and I was just wondering, what are you doing about that these days? And if there's any kind of a positive response, they could say, well, let me broker an introduction between you and this lawyer, and you can just talk it through. So that's huge. Client service. I mean, this is just the holy grail, because most law firms, it's really hard to differentiate them from one to another. And so one of the last bastions of differentiation is the experience that the client has working with their lawyer. And from what I've seen of the industry statistics, from what I hear from clients, they're not regularly blown away by the level of service. This is a program totally in and of itself. I've got a program called the 5 Pillars of Exceptional Client Service. That is a wow factor. So these are some of the big accelerators. We've tapped on a couple of others, the key measures accelerator, the accountability accelerator, how you actually approach a lawyer in the firm to bring up the topic is a very sensitive art form. So there's a lot of things to think about that go into something that sounds as simple as cross-selling. There's a lot under the surface that should happen if you really want to maximize the outcome.
Yes. And speaking of that, we're going to have a lot of listeners right now that are saying to themselves, I have so many contacts, you've really opened up my eyes to the opportunities I'm leaving. I could definitely take advantage of this. I have the right culture in place with my employees. The passion is there. I'm ready to get started with business development and do all this. What's the timeline though? Who does it start with? How does it kind of move along into the rest of the law firm? And what's a reasonable amount of time to start implementing some of these things you're talking about? Yeah, no,
it's a great question. And this goes into, a model that I have that I call CultureShift, because it doesn't happen in a day. We wish it could. We wish we could drop the magic fairy dust and it all happens, but it's really a choreographed dance. And so I look at a firm at 4 levels. You've got the senior most leadership. You've got mid-level leadership. The lawyer leaders, the practice leaders, department heads, and so on. You've got individual lawyers, and then you've got professionals and staff. And each one of those folks have a different set of roles that have to dance together to be able to make this work. So senior leadership, I think it's important to start out to assess what your culture looks like. I've actually created a free assessment tool that is an internal tool. It takes about 4 minutes for the lawyers to anonymously respond to. And it provides a snapshot of the current culture of business development. From there, the senior team needs to get together and say, what do we want to do here? What's most important based on the input that we've received? From there, I think you get the practice leaders together. And then they start doing some planning within their own group. If you asked about engagement, one of the best ways to get people engaged is if they are a part of the plan. And so to me, when I do retreats, I try to do collaborative planning workshops, so that everybody in the room understands the why and they have a hand in building it. And most people are more motivated to get things done if they're building it. So that would be, maybe a month or so after getting started with the leadership team and they've developed their planning. And then from there, that can take, so that planning session happens, but it could take, a good year to start implementing the initiatives that come out of those planning sessions from the practice or industry groups. And then you've got to have some sort of a tracking system in place, because these things will die. You have to make the assumption that these things will die. And, when I talk to groups and at the end of the retreat, I say, so have you ever been through a process like this before? Yeah, something like that. Have you always implemented everything you came up with? And everybody laughs. Of course not. So then my magic question is, what could you put in place that would absolutely guarantee that you will implement what you came up with today? And it changes the conversation. And it usually is something around, we've got to watch each other. We have to commit that we'll do it. We have to make it visible, report on it during our monthly partner meetings, whatever it is. It needs to be embedded in the DNA to have this watcher tracking accountability process. And then we've got to lay in skills. So the lawyers need to be trained to go and do a process of identifying the cross opportunities and then tracking and managing that. I've actually built some software that can do that. And so there's just a lot of tools that need to be finessed and timed. And you have a great question here, which is around timing. Because just doing these things, if you don't do them in the right sequence, one thing does not psychologically then build upon the other to get the kind of buy-in that we're looking for. So lots of different populations can do lots of different things. In one firm, they created an associates marketing committee, which I thought was brilliant, because now they took ownership of the things that they could be doing at their level of development to build relationships both internally in the firm and also with their peers externally in the marketplace. And they reported getting 50, 60 people to their events that they put on that were just fun, get-to-know-you events, but they recognized it's all about relationships. And now that group was being trained in what it took to build a book of business. So lots of different pieces to this puzzle. And there's a lot of finesse on how you put it together. But every firm's a little different, so they've got to build it in the way that they know that works best for them.
And one final question, David, before we sign off. I know a bunch of lawyers here. They're going to take everything you just said and hit the ground running. Yeah. Are there any specific conversations or maybe some obvious pitfalls they can avoid when making this implementation?
It's really interesting you bring it up, because I think one of the biggest pieces is what you're saying, is the implementation. And so I've got this program called the 5 Habits of Successful Business Development. And the 5th habit is, how do you make it a habit? I mean, this is something that comes and goes. So to create personal implementation systems from an individual lawyer perspective is really critically important. And so I've seen it done in a number of different ways. One is that lawyers can use their own calendar. And so 2 ways to do that. One is, let's say, Ryan, you are a prospective client, and you and I spoke today. I'll put a tickler in my calendar, whatever's right, 2 months, 3 months out, to remind me to get back in touch with you. That's a specific technique. More generally, one of my favorites is for a lawyer to hire themselves at least once a week to focus on business development. And what I mean by that is, if I had a client who said, I'd like to have a standing meeting with you every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10, you would carve out that time, and unless there was a fire, you wouldn't move it. Why is a lawyer not important enough to themselves? So hire yourself for a half hour every week. Pick a time that has the least chance of slipping off your calendar. And then another piece to this is create a buddy system. Maybe bring somebody else into those meetings. So not only are you accountable to yourself, but also to someone else. Study after study shows this is why personal coaching is so helpful with fitness and everything else. When you're accountable to somebody else, you are much more likely to get it done. So build in a time frame and a person or a small group. That's a powerful way to do it. I've seen people use their practice assistants and ask them to help them stay on track, remind them to do X, Y, and Z. I know one who asked their assistant to schedule at least 2 or 3 lunches per week with prospective clients and prospective referral sources. And it was that assistant's job to get back in touch with the lawyer to say, hey, let's sit down and talk about it. Who should it be? And when do you have open? And that was a great exoskeletal reminder system to have in place. So it's building these systems that can really make or break the success, because it's all about creating new habits and new rituals that are not common for most lawyers to have in place.
It sounds like having the team to keep you accountable as well really helps.
Huge. We do things so much better in groups than we do alone. It's the rare person that has that ability to really drive themselves. And so we do have high performing people. We get it, but this one usually falls lower on the priority list. We need to create almost artificial prioritization to make it stand up and be bigger. And that's why doing things with groups and so on can really do that for you.
Where can our listeners find those assessments and tools that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think, the easiest thing is just to go onto the website. It's lawfirmcultureshift.com. Look under the services tab and play around in there. And that's probably the best place to learn the range of things that we could bring to the table.
Great. Any other speaking engagements, webinars, articles, white papers, any sort of content that kind of goes over what are topics covered today?
There's another section, the resources section. I've got leadership tips, business development tips, videos, written quick other tips. And so there's a lot of different pieces in there that are content. And I think probably you would agree, getting content out is very, very important in the mix of things. And I'm always happy to share a lot of what I know and do, because, I think it's critical that we all raise the bar in the knowledge point, because then we all get better at this game and we all want to help each other get better. It's part of what the ecosystem is about.
Thanks for listening to the Legal Mastermind podcast. If you're interested in working with Ryan and Chase, please email mastermind@marketmymarket.com. Make sure to join the free mastermind group for growing and managing your firm at lawfirmmastermind.com. Ryan Klein and Chase Williams are the managing partners at Market My Market, one of the top legal marketing companies in the United States.